Well, hello everyone. My name is Alex Kilroy, and I am an author, and I want to talk today about the perspective that stories are told from. Typically, we call these the third-person perspective or the first-person perspective, and there's also a second-person perspective, and we will get into that. There are very unique and interesting and exciting advantages to each of these three storytelling perspectives, and I'm going to go briefly into all three of them in this video. I am releasing not only this video, but all of the diagrams, all of which I have made myself, into public domain. I have no intention of making any money on this. I do use examples from very famous pieces of literature, some of which are copyrighted. This thing is for educational purposes only. That's why it's in public domain and for educational purposes only. So who are these three mysterious people that are telling the story? Well, the first person is actually the hero of the story, or the protagonist. The second person is you, the reader. Most of the time we don't think of the reader as participating in the story, but without the reader there is no story. So you have to participate, otherwise who's the teller of the story going to talk to? The third person is usually the storyteller, and this is a person who does not participate in the story, but is magically aware of all the things around him, and we'll get to what all of this means. The first person is a person who is actually participating in the story, and it's usually the main character or the protagonist, and all of the actions in the story are revolving around him or her. Some of the famous main characters in storytelling are Luke Skywalker, and possibly even Darth Vader. We'll get to more on that later. Harry Potter is the main character of the Harry Potter series. That's why the books are named after him. Another famous main character would be Ishmael from Moby Dick. And of course, the most famous main character of any story would arguably be Jesus from the Gospels. Okay, here's where the fun begins. The second person in the story is, of course, you. You are the second person, the reader. And telling stories from the second person perspective, or you are telling the story that you are reading, is kind of counterintuitive right from the beginning. And that's why it's really not used much, at least it hasn't been until recent days. Now, one of the most obvious first uses of the second person were books that were called the Choose Your Own Adventure books, and these took on all kinds of different forms, and you could get to the end of a section and it said if you want to do this and attack the dragon, turn to page 88, or not attack the dragon, turn to page 42, or whatever. And those were a second person story. The other most obvious use of second person is ironically called the first person shooter games. So if you have video games where you're going around blasting aliens or zombies or whatever, you are actually doing it. Ironically, it's called a first-person shooter when it really should be called a second-person shooter, but, we got to keep things to a certain level of confusion. Okay, now, for what you've all been waiting for, this is the third-person perspective. So, who is this mysterious third person? Well, the third person is someone who's not participating in the story. And they're actually invisible both to you and they're invisible to the people participating in the story. The advantage of this, and why it is probably the most common method of storytelling, is because you can do a lot of things. This third person sees and knows just about everything that's going on in the story. For example, if you have, like in Star Wars, where you have scenes where Darth Vader is going around doing stuff that Luke Skywalker's not even aware of, and vice versa, a third-person storytelling can make that very easy to do. One of the most important things to keep in mind when you're reading a story or watching a story told from a third-person perspective is that the narrator of the story might be keeping things from you. He or she may not be telling you the whole story, at least not at first. The best example of this would be the original Star Wars trilogy. Most people will say that the main character of the story is, of course, Luke Skywalker. However, what's interesting is that the first character we actually see of any real major importance is actually Darth Vader. Now, when we go on to The Empire Strikes Back, we find out that Anakin Skywalker, Luke's father, is Darth Vader. And that's when we realize that the main character of this story is not Luke Skywalker. It never was Luke Skywalker. It was Darth Vader the whole time, which makes sense. He's the first person we see in the movie of any consequence. And at the beginning of The Empire Strikes Back, the prologue is really concerned with the fact that Darth Vader is looking for Luke Skywalker, and Luke is just sort of, bouncing around house trying to figure out something to do. And all of the actions are centered around Vader. They're not centered around Luke Skywalker. That concludes my basic overview of the third-person perspective. What's important to remember here is that this third person is invisible to you, the reader, and to the main characters, or all of the characters, in the story. And also that the third person sees, somehow magically, everything that's going on. But the most important thing to remember about the third-person perspective is this. They can choose what to tell the reader and what not to tell him. So there's this expectation that the third person who's telling the story will keep things from you as the story goes on in order to surprise you with them later. One of the reasons that this type of deception is so effective is that we see things that people in the story do not. So if we see that there's a bad guy knocking at the door, and that the good guy does not have a clue on the bad guy is actually just on the other side of the door, we end up screaming, "No, don't open the door, it's the bad guy!" But the reality is that there is a reason that this third person has told the story that way, because there's something that you may not know about the bad guy behind the door and the person in front of the door, which may be that the roles are reversed. The bad guy might be the good guy, and the good guy may not be as good as you think he is. Or the good guy might be related to the bad guy in a way that you don't realize. For example, in Harry Potter, there is a connection between Harry Potter and Voldemort in that Harry is a Horcrux for Voldemort. Or in other words, Harry Potter contains part of Voldemort's soul. So these are the things that you encounter with a third-person perspective story, and it makes for good storytelling. So please keep your eyes out for the next two videos in this series, which would be the first-person perspective and the second-person perspective, where I will go into much greater detail on what these things are and why they're cool in storytelling. This is Alex Kilroy. Thank you so much for watching this video. Again, please share and to your heart's delight, and you have a wonderful day and a great day telling stories.